Hey everyone, and welcome back. Have you ever felt like those official inflation numbers, the ones they talk about all the time, just don't really match up with what you're seeing like when you're at the store?
I know I have.
Yeah, it's a common feeling.
It's like we're all hearing about the Consumer Price Index or CPI, but
Yeah,
does that really tell us the whole story about how prices are actually impacting different people here in the UK? You know what I mean?
exactly. The CPI, it gives us a very broad picture,
Yeah.
but it can definitely miss a lot of the details and the nuances.
Right, so it's not really personalized.
Right.
So that's what we're diving into today.
That's what we're going to look at. So that's where the UK's Household Cost Indices, or HCIs, come in. They offer a much more granular view
Okay.
by focusing on specific household groups, not just this sort of theoretical average person.
Okay, so instead of lumping everyone together in one big pot, we're going to get a more personalized view of inflation. You know how it's actually hitting your wallet?
Precisely.
And to do this, they use something called income deciles.
Yeah.
Now imagine lining up all UK households from lowest to highest income and then splitting them into 10 equal groups.
Okay.
Each group is an income decile. So decile 1 represents the lowest 10% of earners, decile 10 is the top 10%, and so on.
Makes sense.
The HCIs track how inflation is impacting each of these groups differently.
So we're about to go deep into some fascinating data from the Office for National Statistics, or ONS, from December 2024. And we're going to see how inflation's really playing out across the UK.
Yes, we are.
Let's start with the big picture. The ONS report says the overall UK household cost increase, or HCI, was 2.8% for the year ending in December 2024.
Wow.
That's a pretty big jump from the 2% in the previous quarter.
Yeah, it's a notable increase. And what's interesting is that this 2.8% is actually higher than the December 2024 CPI of 2.5%. So right off the bat, this suggests the broader CPI might not be capturing the full impact of inflation for a lot of households.
I'm already seeing a trend here. So the ONS report also says that this overall inflation rate really closely mirrored what middle-income households experienced. Specifically, those in the sixth income decile saw a 2.7% increase.
Uh-huh.
That kind of seems to suggest that the middle class is taking the biggest hit, right?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
While it's true that middle-income households experience inflation that was close to the average, we have to be really careful about generalizations. High-income households, those in decile 9, actually saw a 3.2% increase, while low-income households in decile 2 had a 2.6% increase.
So even what seems like a small percentage difference, like we're talking a few percentage points here, can make a big impact on different income groups just depending on their budget.
Absolutely.
Wow. So let's shift gears a bit and look at how housing kind of factors into all of this.
Yes, look.
The data clearly shows that where you live and how you pay for it has a huge impact on how much inflation you're actually feeling.
It does.
The numbers for renters were pretty alarming to me. I know rent has been a hot topic lately.
Yeah. And you're right to be concerned. Private renters, they faced a whopping 3.9% inflation rate, which was the highest of any group.
Wow.
And the main driver, you guessed it, rising rental costs.
Ouch, that's a tough situation, especially when you compare it to the lowest rate, which was 2.1% enjoyed by outright homeowners.
Right.
It really does seem like owning your home outright is the best way to kind of weather this inflation storm.
It certainly seems that way from this data. And even those with mortgages, or mortgagors as they're called in the report, didn't fare too well. They were hit with a 3.1% inflation rate, likely due to those increasing interest rates we've all been hearing about.
Yeah, it's definitely making me rethink my plans to buy a house.
Yeah, I feel that.
But before I totally spiral, let's talk about another interesting difference that the report highlights: retired versus non-retired households. So non-retired households saw 3% inflation, which is higher than retired households at 2.3%. What do you think is going on there? Could it be that non-retired folks are more affected by things like, commuting costs and childcare, which we all know have been going up?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's very likely that non-retired households are feeling the pinch more acutely in categories like transportation, childcare, and even just general goods and services. Those costs tend to impact working-age people more than retirees.
Okay, that makes sense. Retired folks are probably less impacted by those, like daily expenses.
Right.
But there's something I'm really curious about, and it's these democratic weights that the ONS uses for HCIs. Can you kind of break that down for us? How do they actually work, and why are they different from the CPI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it all comes down to how they calculate the importance of each spending category, like food or housing. In the CPI, the weight of each category reflects the average spending of the entire UK population. It's very much a one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay.
But with HCIs, things get a bit more personalized.
So are you saying that they actually adjust those weights based on each income group's actual spending habits? That seems a lot more realistic than the CPI's one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. The weight of each category in the HCI reflects the average spending of that specific household group, not the overall population.
So can you give us an example so we can really see how this works in practice?
Absolutely. So let's look at food, a category we can all relate to.
Yeah.
For low-income households in decile 2, the food weight is 14.8%
Okay.
because on average they spend a larger portion of their income on groceries.
Makes sense.
But for higher income households in decile 9, the food weight is only 10.7%. They have more disposable income. So they tend to spend more on things like restaurants and hotels, which have a 12.8% weight for them compared to 8.4% for decile 2.
So if I'm like someone who spends a big chunk of my income on rent, the HCI would actually reflect that more accurately than the CPI.
You got it.
Okay.
And this kind of leads us to another key difference between HCIs and the CPI. It all comes down to how they factor in housing costs.
Let me guess, this is where those mortgage interest rates come into play.
You're on a roll. HCIs directly factor in mortgage interest rates and other housing costs, while the CPI relies on an indirect measure called equivalent rental price. It tries to estimate how much it would cost to rent a similar property, but it's not always accurate, especially in a volatile housing market like we've seen recently.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense why mortgagers, those with mortgages, experience significantly higher inflation, 3.1% compared to outright owners, 2.1% in the HCI data. They're directly feeling those interest rate hikes.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember that HCIs are still kind of a work in progress, right?
That's right. The ONS is constantly refining its methodology and adding new data to improve accuracy.
So what kind of updates are they working on? What can we expect to see in the future?
Well, they recently added non-mortgage interest payments, which includes things like overdraft interest, and they updated their stamp duty data, pretty granular stuff.
Yeah, it's like they're leaving no stone unturned in their quest for like total accuracy. But speaking of getting into the nitty-gritty, I'm really curious about the ONS's plans to add in calculations for interest payments on unsecured loans. Could that reveal even more about how inflation is impacting different income groups?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. And the answer is most likely yes. It makes sense if you think about it. People with lower incomes might be more reliant on those types of loans. And if interest rates keep climbing, they'll definitely feel the squeeze more than those who aren't as dependent on credit.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect, isn't it? Those rising interest rates can have a much bigger impact on certain groups than others.
Exactly. And it really speaks to the power of these HCIs. They're not just a bunch of, dry statistics. They're providing a glimpse into the lived experiences of different groups in the UK, particularly when it comes to their finances. There's like each HCI is telling a different story about the economy.
So we're hearing the story of the homeowner who's relatively comfortable, the story of the renter who's struggling to keep up.
Right, exactly.
It's fascinating how these numbers can reveal so much about people's lives.
It really is. It's like having different lenses to view the same phenomenon, right? And that's incredibly valuable because it allows us to move beyond these broad pronouncements about inflation and really get a sense of how specific groups are being impacted.
And if we're talking about looking ahead, I'm also curious about those plans to update the weighting system in 2025. How might that shift our understanding of the data?
Well, remember, these weights reflect how much each household group is spending on different categories. If the ONS finds, for example, that low-income households are now spending an even larger portion of their income on food, they would increase the food weight for that group. Essentially, they're constantly calibrating the scales to make sure they're reflecting reality.
So any changes to those weights, even seemingly small ones, could have a pretty big impact on how we interpret the data.
Absolutely. They're not just technical tweaks. They can significantly affect our understanding of the economic pressures facing different households.
You know, all this talk about how inflation is measured makes me think about something I read in the ONS report. They mentioned that there's often a disconnect between the public's perception of inflation and the actual CPI data. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a few factors at play. First, as we've been discussing, the CPI is a very broad measure. It can't capture all the little specific price changes that people experience in their daily lives. Imagine the price of your weekly food shop has skyrocketed, but the CPI is only inched up slightly. You probably feel like those official numbers are out of touch with your reality.
Especially if those price increases are in essential areas like food or energy bills. Those are the things that really hit people's wallets hard.
Exactly. And even within those categories, there could be massive variations. The CPI might show a small increase in food prices overall, but if the specific items you buy every week have gone up by a lot, you're going to feel it much more acutely. It's like the average can sometimes mask individual pain points.
It's like when you get that sticker shock at the grocery store and you're like, wait, wasn't this cheaper last week?
Precisely. And I think the media plays a role too. Headlines about soaring inflation or the cost of living crisis can definitely shape people's perceptions, even if their personal experience isn't quite as dramatic.
Yeah.
It can create a bit of a feedback loop. The more we hear about inflation, the more we feel it, even if the numbers don't necessarily reflect that.
So it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In a way, yes, but it's also important to remember that some people might actually be experiencing inflation that's lower than the CPI suggests. If you happen to spend a lot on goods or services that have gone down in price, you might be in a better position than the average person. It's all relative.
This is why I love these deep dives. It's like we're taking something that seems really complex and breaking it down into something that feels understandable and relevant to our lives.
I agree. It's about taking those numbers and turning them into a narrative that we can all connect with.
Speaking of narratives, it seems like these HCIs are painting a pretty compelling one about the state of the UK economy. What does this all mean for policymakers? How can they use this information to help the people who are struggling the most?
Well, for starters, it highlights the need for targeted support instead of broad brush measures that might miss the mark. They can use these HCIs to pinpoint the groups that are being hit hardest by inflation and tailor their policies accordingly. It's about being precise and strategic with your interventions.
So, for example, if they see that private renters are facing a much higher inflation rate than homeowners, they might consider specific policies to help renters cope with those rising rental costs.
Exactly. And it's not just about addressing immediate needs, it's about thinking long-term as well. If we see that certain demographic groups consistently experience higher inflation rates, it points to deeper structural inequalities that need to be addressed.
So it's like using the data to not only put out fires, but to prevent them from starting in the first place. Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's about using these insights to create a more equitable and resilient economy where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, no matter their income or housing situation.
That's a great point. We've been talking a lot about the technical details of these HCIs, but it's important to remember that at the heart of it all, we're talking about people's lives and their economic well-being.
Absolutely. These numbers represent real people facing real challenges.
I think that's a powerful message, and it really underscores the importance of data like these HCIs. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're a window into the lives of real people, and they can be a powerful tool for creating positive change. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how these different inflation experiences might shape the political landscape in the UK? Could they lead to social or political movement?
That's a really fascinating question, and I think it is something we'll see play out in the coming months and years as these HEIs become more widely known and people understand them better. They could absolutely fuel political discourse and even potentially lead to new social movements. I mean, think about it. If people start to see very clearly, how inflation is affecting them differently based on their income, their housing situation, or even their age, it could definitely shift their political priorities and alliances.
Like those HCIs are giving people like a new way to see the whole economic landscape.
Yeah.
And that new perspective could have a huge impact on how they vote, how they engage with their communities, and what kind of policies they demand.
Exactly. It could be a real game changer in terms of how we think about and address economic inequality in the UK.
So for our listeners out there who are ready to dive into this data themselves, where can they go to kind of explore these HCIs in more depth?
Well, the Office for National Statistics website is the best place to start. They have so much information on HCIs, including breakdowns by income, decile housing, tenure, retirement status, you name it. You can really get granular with it and see how the data applies to your own situation or the groups you're most interested in.
It's like having a personalized inflation calculator at your fingertips.
That's a great way to put it. And the beauty of it is that the ONS is constantly refining their methodology and adding new data. So it's a resource that will just keep getting more and more valuable over time.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. We've gone deep into these HCIs, explored how they're calculated, and, discussed why they really matter.
It's been a great conversation. We've peeled back the layers of inflation and really seen how it's impacting different segments of UK society.
And for me, the big takeaway is that we just can't rely on a single one-size-fits-all view of the economy.
Right.
We really need to understand those diverse experiences of different households and use that knowledge to build